Hi there, and thank you for joining our presentation. I guess you probably figured out I'm Lynn, and this is my husband Jim. So we write Salish Sea Pilot cruising guides, and we're just thrilled to be announcing the recent publication of our newest guide to the west coast of Vancouver Island. And our hope is that by the end of this presentation, you'll have some more insight into the rewards and challenges to sailing on the West Coast. And I'm going to refer, when I refer to the West Coast, I mean the West Coast of Vancouver Island, but it's less of a mouthful to just call it the West Coast. Yeah, maybe you'll feel ready to take it on if you haven't yet. And if you have cruised that coastline before, maybe we'll get you interested in going to some places that you didn't visit the first time around. Okay, so we'll just get started. Like us all, COVID changed our plans last summer when our intention to go to Alaska was changed. We considered going around Vancouver Island instead. So we'd been asked many times by people to do a guide to that coast, so we thought that maybe this was the year.
And before leaving, we first called marinas and communities along the outer coast to find out what was open during the pandemic. Basically, we were told we'd be welcomed everywhere except some parks and First Nations docks and territory. Bull Harbor is the typical starting point for a cruise down the west coast. You can provision in Port McNeill or Port Hardy. Either is a good spot to await a weather window to go around Cape Scott, and both have cell coverage, unlike Bull Harbor. Here we are arriving in Bull Harbor. The First Nations community dock that you see there is coming into view, was closed. And oh, sorry. Yeah, and we had fans. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say that dock and Bull Harbor is First Nations territory, and even in non-COVID times, you can't go ashore. You can tie up to the dock, but you can't leave it.
Okay. and we had fans. Using our inReach, we sent family members messages every night so they could keep track of our progress. Here is our granddaughter, Tora, holding the map of the island she drew to track us.
So in Bull Harbor, we anchored beside Jose and Monse, a couple from Vancouver that we met while we were in the Cordero Islands, and we decided to buddy boat around the island with them. And here's their lovely boat, Cassiopeia, a Pacific Seacraft Mariah 31. So it can get busy in Bull Harbor in a normal year with everyone waiting for good weather, but it was pretty quiet when we were there.
And this is the Nuwidi Bar page from our new guide. The sea here goes from very deep to very shallow. Vast quantities of water cross the bar in ebb and flood. And when strong winds blow against flow, the seas can get violent there. Boats can also sail down south of Tatnall Reefs, down at the bottom, to avoid the bar. And this opens other timing options for going around Cape Scott.
So in an ideal world, one would have slack tide at both Cape Scott and Nuwidi Bar, but that's just not possible if you're doing it in a one-day transit. So if you choose to cross the bar at slack tide, which you certainly should, be aware of the winds that you'll be heading into at Cape Scott. And if the forecast is for deteriorating weather, just consider your options in case it comes sooner than forecast. So I'm going to just explain here why the maps that you're looking at have these blue boxes. They're actually pictures of pages in our e-guides, and the blue boxes are links to expanded maps of the location. So I'm going to play this short video and you can see what I mean. I have to talk really fast, so hopefully I can keep up with it. I tape going too fast, so here we go. So if you tap on Cape Scott and around, that takes you to section A, and then you can zoom in on the anchorage at Otter Cove. You can see where the trailhead is, and that's information about the buoys or docks if that's what you're looking at. That's the link to the main menu. You can change to, for example, section E, and take a look at Walters Cove, zoom in on what's on shore and the dock layout, And then that icon always takes you to the beginning of the section. So section E again. You can look at another anchorage, and you can also scroll through them. This is taken on a tablet. Back to the main menu, which has links, general information, wind and weather, currents, that kind of thing, provisioning. So that's basically why those maps have those blue squares.
And this was 6 a.m. when we set off from Bull Harbor. No wind was forecast, so we decided to go straight across the bar. It was uneventful. There was a bit of swell, but overall, no problem.
You could see with the bit of swell that there was that it could get quite nasty.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so here we are at Scenic Cape Scott. So fog rolled in shortly after crossing the Nuwidi Bar and stayed with us right up to Sea Otter Cove, making the trip actually rather boring. We were glad we had AIS and radar, and we stayed pretty much at the 30-meter line to avoid any current, and so there really wasn't any current that affected us. We just saw a few fishing boats on our radar, but that was it. Cape Scott was a little bit choppy, but nothing at all daunting. You know, and I would say that like any other potentially rough body of water, you just have to avoid it in nasty weather and make sure you know what your boat can handle and what you're comfortable with. It may be your first time experiencing ocean swells, and it takes a little while to feel comfortable with that, but my suggestion would be to have snacks and meals ready that you can just grab so you don't have to go down below deck, because often that's when the nausea will hit you, is when you go down below. And of course, the fog lifted as we entered Sea Otter Cove about 6.5 hours later. Some people may choose to pass this anchorage completely and just go all the way to Claspino Sound, which is about another 5-ish hours on.
And we tied to hurricane buoys at Sea Otter Cove. There are 4 of these buoys there, as well as quite a bit of room to anchor. It was a challenge tying up to the buoy with our anchor colliding with the metal top bar, and the tires left some pretty ugly black streaks on our topside. From the head of Sea Otter Cove, there's a very rough trail to the beach at Flowery Bay. We set off with our friends from Cassiopeia. Sometimes the trail disappeared, and we almost turned back, but persistence pays off.
It really was a beautiful beach in Flowery Bay. There was also one other boat in Sea Otter Cove when we arrived, and their crew was on the beach with us. So they were doing the circumnavigation clockwise, having done it anti-clockwise in a previous year. And they told us about an awful time on anchor in Columbia Cove coming up and warned us to be well dug in. And we promptly forgot about that.
Yeah. And here we walked the beach, discovering a surfer hut, and it was fully furnished with a step-saver kitchen about the size of a galley on our boat, and sleeping accommodations for 2.
So the next day we headed to Claspino Sound, about 25 miles to the anchorage in North Harbor that you see there labeled B1. So with day hops to safe anchorages all along the coast, you never really have to go about more than 35 to 40 miles. But, you know, it's a good idea to have a plan B just in case the weather changes suddenly, which can happen. Here we are anchored in North Harbor, and we kayaked up nearby Browning Inlet, getting pretty close to some sea otters. First time we'd seen them, and it was great fun to watch them.
And you know, we just have to say, you know, we've all heard about the comeback of sea otters on the West Coast, but I certainly wasn't ready for how many we would see and how the colonies would raft together. There'd be dozens of adults and youngsters bobbing about in the waves all around you. It was just tremendous.
It really was.
Yeah. So exciting. You know, they've gone from 89 sea otters that were brought from Alaska 50 years ago, and they've spread north to the Broughtons and south to around Tofino. It's just such a happy story. It's just amazing.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. So, okay, the next day we headed to Winter Harbor, which is only about 5 miles from the anchorage. And some with bigger dinghies might decide to just dinghy there and back, but we took Sea Loan there because we were hoping for a meal in their cafe, which is called Be More Pacific. But unfortunately, it was closed that day. But what a lovely spot to have fish and chips. So there's a marina in Winter Harbor. You can fill up with fuel and water, and there's a small grocery store.
And this is the eastern end of Quatsino Sound. To give you an idea of distance, from Winter Harbor in the west to Cole Harbor in the northeast, it's about 27 nautical miles.
And this is the entrance to Julian Cove. It's got that lovely lone tree island at the mouth into the anchorage. On our way here, we stopped by the lighthouse that's near the entrance to Quatsino Sound to get cell reception and get some updated weather from Windy. Okay, so let's talk weather here. Once you pass Port Hardy, there's very little cell coverage until Clayaquot Sound, which is well down the coast.
And when we have a cell, we use the Windy app quite a bit. We have found it to be pretty accurate, and the free version provides forecasts for every 3 hours for up to a week ahead. When we could get cell from a marina or lighthouse, we would take screenshots of forecasts for the next 3 or 4 days. Of course, that's pushing the limits of reliability of forecasts on the West Coast.
And I also found, Jim's not sure he agrees with me, but I found that the wind gusts, the sort of bottom line there of the wind speeds, the wind gusts was actually more true to what the wind was that you were going to experience than that sustained wind that they forecast. Anyway, the Environment Canada forecasts on the VHF for this coast are very general and cover vast areas, including far offshore. So often the weather that they're forecasting, is really not the weather that you'll experience close to the coast or up the inlets. And there were also several places where our VHF coverage was basically non-existent, and we had to get those forecasts over the SSB. But those are not continuously broadcast like they are on VHF. They're broadcast every 6 hours. So if you happen to miss one broadcast, you've got a bit of a wait for the next one. So we were really lucky. Jim's sister texted us the windy forecasts on our InReach device, coded to fit many days into 140 characters. But that worked really well for us. But not everyone has such a helpful sibling. Okay, moving on to Cole Harbor, where we enjoyed watching this plane get launched. The museum there was quite interesting. World War II Navy memorabilia and fishing and whaling history artifacts. And there's also a marina there, so you can get fuel and water, but it's definitely not, there's no store, so there's no provisioning.
And from there, we moved on to Barney Bay, where it was wet and windy for the most part. When we arrived, we had to stay on the boat all day, watching other boats drag, one several times, even after repeatedly re-anchoring. This photo looking out from Barney Bay up the inlet is a view back to Cole Harbor.
So the next morning, we went up the Marble River in the rain. This is just a really, really great trip, and I think it's well worth the detour. There were seals, the water was so clear, and you could see the seals swimming under your boat and all around, hanging around the rocks on the edge of the river. And eagles were swooping down along the gorge. It was just absolutely amazing.
And there are several sets of rapids, and it's up this river. And it's remarkable how quickly they disappeared as the tide rose. You should time your trip to go up on a rising tide and float down with the ebb. Kind of looks a little bit crazy. I don't know if that was a look of terror or what, but this cave was a lot of fun along the river. And then we went on to Pamphlet Cove, which turned out to be another favorite anchorage of ours. There's room for 2 or 3 boats, and it's good shore tying there. There was lots of sun till late in the day. At higher tides, there's also a lovely lagoon here to to explore it. It's got really crystal clear water.
Yeah,
It's very,
yeah,
it was
lovely.
very cool.
That was one of my highlights too.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay, so we were up at 5:30 the next morning because we figured we had a bit of a long slog, but heavy fog held off our departure to Claspino Inlet until around 11 o'clock, and that became a theme. There was a lot of fog in the morning. Yeah. So it's about 28 nautical miles down the coast to Claspino Inlet, and this is Brooks Peninsula with Solander Island off it. That's your view as you leave Quatsino Sound and turn south. And this is a look at that next little bit of coastline. So you can see Brooks Peninsula sticking out like that. And one thing that you'll hear on your forecast a lot is something like winds 10 to 20, except 20 to 30 north of Brooks Peninsula or south of Brooks Peninsula. And it's really true that it seems to create its own local weather pattern. So Claspino and Claskish are both really great anchorages to wait for a weather window to go around the peninsula.
Then we dropped our hook in Claspino Inlet. We couldn't resist launching our kayak to go for a paddle.
The water there was amazingly clear.
Yeah, and it feels very remote there because was no VHF weather reception available, and that makes you feel cut off from the rest of the world even more than you would feel normally. Next morning, it was a short ride to Claskish Basin, the other anchorage just north of Brooks Peninsula. This is a very, very narrow entrance as you're entering it. And here there were waterfalls all around after an overnight rain.
And at the head of that basin is the Claskish River, which we were able to kayak up about a mile before log jams forced us back. 2 other boats joined us at anchor there, and we all ended up staying 3 nights waiting for better weather to go around Brooks Peninsula. So the biggest factor to a safe and enjoyable cruise of the West Coast, in my opinion, is time. Hopefully you'll have plenty of it and you won't have to sail to a schedule. There are several capes along the West Coast with rather sort of ominous reputations, and we're pretty cautious sailors, but we approach them all the same way. If conditions were at all in question, we just stayed put. Yeah, be prepared to skip some of the places if the weather does hold you up, and be realistic about how much you're going to be able to see if you have to complete it within a certain time frame. Being able to just wait meant that we didn't have to deal with any unpleasant seas or weather when we were doing our hops kind of outside.
And it was a bit of a slog motoring into the swell around the peninsula and past Solander Island, as you see there. When in swell, we store everything that can possibly move, stuff, cushions in our lockers, so we don't have to listen to loose items crashing about and crashing into each other.
It just seems to increase your anxiety.
Yes.
Okay, so here's Columbia Cove. That's just around the other side of Brooks Peninsula. There were actually 5 boats overnighting there, and we went for a hike to a beach that's on the other side of the point. And when we returned, I wasn't happy with where we were anchored, so we re-anchored to a spot that wasn't quite so close to shore. We were anchored up by the number 2 there. Anyways, we were glad we did because a howling wind, just unbelievably strong, came up out of nowhere. There were whitecaps in that little cove, and everybody was out on deck making sure that they weren't dragging. And it died down after about 25 minutes, something like that, pretty much as quickly as it came on. And then we remembered that other boat that we met in Sea Otter Cove warning us about Columbia Cove. So the walk to the beach on the other side has to be timed carefully because this bay dries out completely at low tide, and you could be left carrying your dinghy a long, long way. So all decked out in bells and carrying a foghorn and bear spray, we set off. We pretty much did all our hikes equipped like that. Kind of a joke.
Bells and bear spray. The trail was not too bad once we found it, and the beach was well worth it. It was beachcombing at its finest. That's quite a pile of rope I'm standing on.
You don't want to get that caught in your propeller.
No.
And here's the view looking across Columbia Cove. And that's looking out of the cove towards the Bunsby Islands, which is about 8 miles away, I think, to the Bunsbys.
Mm.
And this is one of the many reefs that you sail past on the way there.
And here I'm taking a stern line to shore at Scow Bay in the Bunsbys. We didn't have the best weather there. I should say that we did stern tie a lot of places along the west coast. There were some really tiny anchorages where it was really so much more convenient and you felt a lot safer.
Yeah.
And we kayaked the many islands in the Bunsbys and made the best of the terrible weather. And then next we headed to Walters Cove, about 10 miles away. You can see it just at the bottom at the opening to the sound. And first timers might find the entrance a little tricky.
We certainly did.
As you can see, it's a bit of a maze. You just mutter red right returning under your breath as you go through and you should be okay.
And this is the visitor dock. And here again, we met up with Cassiopeia. They got apparently a well-known cafe called Java the Hut, which was sadly closed due to COVID, but we were able to stock up on groceries and also check our email with the Wi-Fi password that was kindly given to us from someone who lived across the bay and took pity on us.
And we were also able to take a short walk to a beach nearby, past a couple old growth trees, and played in the swing on the beach and poked around in the tidal pools there.
And then over the next several days, we visited many anchorages in Kayaker Sound. And this is the channel into Blue Lips Cove. There are a lot of these little narrow channels that you go into, these almost landlocked coves and bays.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, we paddled around in our kayak and were convinced that we found the rumored petroglyphs that are on the rocks there. And from Blue Lips Cove, we set off early in the morning to go ashore at Rugged Point for a few hours. So this anchorage is pretty much only suitable in settled weather. It's quite exposed. And it's a short walk to, honestly, the most beautiful beach that we've ever seen on Vancouver Island. The sand is incredibly fine, and it's got this sort of, like, it looks like it's rippled there, like a normal beach gets rippled, but it's actually perfectly flat. And but it looks layered, very cool. And we collected sand dollars like this one that conveniently left arrows pointing to their whereabouts.
And we tore ourselves away from the beach and left to transit Clear Passage en route to Esperanza Inlet. With the rocky shore to port and these ominous reefs to starboard, you'd want to keep an eye on the charts in the so-called Clear Passage, and best to avoid in fog. And then we're off to Rolling Roadstead. It's on the left of the map you're looking at. Katala Island is a delightful anchorage in all but the strongest winds. There are beautiful rock formations along the shore to explore and a wide sandy beach to stretch your legs.
So the next few slides are scenes from Nuchalx Park. This is one place where you will want to navigate carefully, but it is one of the most beautiful places that we visited. This was taken looking west from the approach to the anchorage on a very calm day. You'll want to keep a close eye on your chart plotter here and follow the marked channel into that anchorage number 1 very carefully. And this is the view from the anchorage. Really lovely.
And then we arrived in Zabalas, where there's a fuel dock and a liquor store with a few very basic groceries and snacks, but it's not a place to provision. A small museum was opened by appointment for us. There was Wi-Fi outside the post office, and we wandered around the village There were a few heritage buildings to look at, but it was suffering quite a bit from the lack of trade from some summer visitors.
On the way to Tassos, we met up with friends. Their father owns a small resort near Tassos Narrows, and because it was COVID, the resort was closed, so we were able to tie up on their dock and have a visit with them. And it's a lovely spot. They even have this hot tub that's heated by burning wood inside a metal box that's set right into the water. They have their own chef, and they cater to small family reunions and fishing groups.
And Matt and Joss are professional scuba divers who do marine search and research and surveys along the northern BC coast. Last winter, they wintered in Haida Gwaii.
Experiencing some incredible, I think they had one night they had like 65 or 69 knot winds while they were anchored.
Yeah. Scary. And okay, then we're on to Tassos, where we enjoyed a bit of socializing. The Marina has a courtesy card that you can use to get groceries in town.
Yeah, we had a good time there.
Yeah.
And next morning, I had a wistful look back down Tassos Inlet, which I think is one of the most beautiful inlets that we went up. And while looking back, I nearly ran into this whale. So it was right in front of the boat. And in fact, I thought it was a log when I first saw something in the water, and I slowed right down. And then it let out a breath, and I realized it was a whale. And I honestly, I think if I hadn't slowed down, I would have hit it. Might have been two whales, I don't know. Anyways, there it or they go, heading for Tassos.
And our last anchorage in Nuka Sound was Friendly Cove. We called the lighthouse, seeing if they'd take us on a tour, but it was closed for COVID. And we were not able to go ashore anywhere there. It would have been a wonderful place with a lot of great trails. And unfortunately, weren't able to go.
A lovely church, apparently, to go and see.
Yeah. When we left at first light the next day to round Esteban Point, it was pretty dark and gloomy. There's Cassiopeia following behind us. And it was about 22 miles to the opening of Hesquiat Harbor. There are many, many anchorages in Clayoquot Sound. So we'll touch on just a few. Cougar Annie's Garden at Hesquiat Harbor was unfortunately shut for the pandemic. So we moved on to Hot Springs Cove. As expected, Hot Springs Cove was also closed. It's a special place for boaters in normal times because they get to enjoy the hot springs in the early morning or late evening, avoiding the crowds from Tofino. And this is a slide of Bachandi Bay, about 13 miles from Hot Springs Cove. We sat here for a few rainy days.
Extremely rainy. I think heaviest rain I've almost ever seen.
Yeah. And these waterfalls disappeared as quickly as they came once the rain let up, but they made a lovely sound echoing across the bay. And we attempted there to kayak up the Wata River, which is a series of portages, but eventually we found it easier to just get out and walk.
Okay, and this is near the anchorage at the Megan River Delta, where these falls are behind a small island and provide a constant background noise. And there's this odd, Jim didn't want that slide in there, an odd column of rock. And here we are up the Megan River. The current was incredibly strong, and we had a very vigorous paddle to get here. We made it to this large island in the river where we could park and then explore by foot. Heading back out was a lot faster than going up. And we next headed to Sulphur Passage. We anchored in a bay in the south end with beautiful views looking up the passage.
Just so you know, Whistler Beer is not a sponsor of this talk. We're just satisfied customers. After a bit of break, we got back into the kayak to visit Secret Falls, about a mile and a half south along the shore. Here's the opening to the creek, and hidden away is the 20-meter high falls. Set in a cauldron of rock and twisted trees. It really was worth the travel. They're amazing falls. But it had been a long day in the kayak.
It'd be pretty neat to see those in the spring.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Highlight. Okay, and then the next stop, here's the dock at Ahousaht. It's not actually a transient dock, but they did let us stay the night. There is also an anchorage further down the inlet, lovely anchorage, but unfortunately we weren't able to visit the Warm Springs or walk the trails there due to COVID. And apparently Warm Springs is generous. But we did trade a bottle of homemade wine for a big bag of fresh prawns.
And when we set off to leave the next day, the fog had rolled in. We floated around for a couple hours waiting for it to burn off, but it eventually did, and sunshine and a lovely breeze returned, and we had a few hours of great sailing. And we arrived at another narrow channel, this one leading to Quake Bay, which is another beautiful protected anchorage. And we had a lovely evening, cooked up those prawns, and I changed into my pajamas. We played some cards. Later, we sat out in the bow under the stars, watching distant planes approach Vancouver Airport. Next morning, brought the thickest fog yet. Waiting for it to lift, I performed Lynn's favorite job to delegate. Lubing the manual pump on our rare tan toilet.
So there were lots of anchorages in the southern half of Clayoquot Sound as well. You can see Quake Bay up at the top there, I-1, and the next anchorage that we'll look at is Kennedy Cove down in the lower right corner. So we're actually skipping over a lot of lovely anchorages. So the Kennedy River empties warmish fresh water into the cove here, making it a lovely place to swim. And the locals know that. And so every day boatloads of them show up, and they hang around on the dock there and ride their jet skis up the river. So it is possible here to anchor just a short ways up the river, which looks like a lovely anchorage. We didn't try it, but the current will hold you in place and prevent you from swinging. One sailboat did come in and tie up there for a night. We ended up spending 3 days there. Enjoyed lots of lovely sunsets.
And Tofino doesn't have a really pleasant anchorage. This one off Sloman Island, about 15 minutes by dinghy from Tofino, is probably the best. The current here is not too strong, but it's a challenge to find a space amid all the crab traps.
It's quite a statement when you say that's your best anchorage.
Yeah. A nice thing is that it's close to the Big Tree Trail on Mears Island, which is a lovely place to walk about. And there's another anchorage in Tofino Harbor, the number 3 there, but it's busy with seaplanes, tour boats, and water taxis, as well as crab pots and strong current. The marinas can be tricky to dock at too, and best time for slack tide if you have the maneuverability problems that we have. After a restless night with the chain moaning and grinding as we swirled in the current, we hauled anchor and made for Barkley Sound. Again, thick fog. Thankfully, it lifted some in the early afternoon, and we were able to sail for a couple hours.
The small craft harbor in Nuchalx was very full, but the wharfinger found us a spot, and apparently he turns no boats away. He told me he's paid on commission, and you may have to raft up, but he will find a spot for you.
Yeah. Well run.
Yeah. We walked the busy docks, which are filled with a rather eclectic inventory.
And here's the Enchanter. It's a floating bed and breakfast from Hot Springs Cove, which was tied up nearby. I think they were taking the COVID break to do a major renovation.
We rented bikes and visited many of the beautiful beaches and hiked the really spectacular trails. You can now cycle all the way between Ucluelet and Tofino on new bicycle paths. So that's pretty great.
Yeah. And we shopped and wandered the town.
There's Ucluelet's shopping mall.
And dined out.
In
Yeah.
fine dining.
Yeah, baskets. And we shot another beer commercial. It sounds like we're making fun of Tofino, but we love it there.
Oh, no, Ucluelet.
Oh, you
Yeah.
flew it. Yeah,
Yeah, it
you
was
flew
great.
it. Yes, that's right. And we tore ourselves away and anchored off Refuge Island, where we explored Lucky Creek by dinghy. And there are a series of falls and swimming holes up there. It's really lovely.
I think actually we swam a lot on that coast.
Yeah.
It seemed like it anyways.
Yeah.
I did anyway.
Yeah. No, it's
I can
more
take colder
than-
water.
Yeah. We swam there more than we
More than we
usually do.
thought we would.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
And that night we enjoyed a sunset at yet another anchorage that we had all to ourselves. And that was shot with no filter or anything. It was spectacular. And we spent the next many days exploring anchorages in Barkley Sound. You can see us there anchored off Benson Island in the Broken Group. I just want to say too, we've gone to the Broken Group from Victoria, just going to the Broken Group, and it's actually, if you've got the right weather, it's easy to get there from Victoria, and I would highly recommend it if you don't have the time to do the whole coast.
Yeah.
It's really not that challenging to get there, and it is really spectacular.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful.
We did more beach combing. And here's a kayaker's camp that we think should take first place for the most unique fire pit. It's basically all that's left from a resort that burnt down there that apparently once doubled as a brothel. And this anchorage is definitely a little bit exposed, but in settled weather, which we had, the views were just spectacular.
And eventually we made our way to Banfield, where we anchored in the south end of the inlet and again met up with Cassiopeia. We had a pizza party on shore with a young couple from Australia who were in Canada on a work visa, and they had just bought a Mariah 31, identical to Cassiopeia, to sail back to Australia in. With all the talk of Pacific ski crafts, it was hard to get a word in edgewise, but the haze from the fires in California were settling in, and this was the last sunny day that we'd had for a while.
And it got progressively smoky over the next few days, and then as we got south, it got even denser. And so this is the marina at Port Renfrew, which is a welcome place to stop for the night between Barkley Sound and Victoria. There is an anchorage in Port San Juan, but it can be very uncomfortable. If there's any swell at all, you'll get that swell. And we sailed all next day in that thick, acrid smoke, and it was very disorienting. I found it was anyway. The sound was completely deadened. It was like cotton wool in your ears, and the water there was no wind, so it was heavy and flat, and there was no horizon. And the monotony was broken once by this eerie encounter with a humpback. It was pretty cool, where it just kind of came up out of all the grayness.
And then we returned to Victoria Harbor. There's the breakwater outside of the harbor. And celebrated by drawing a closed circle around the island.
As did Tora back in Winnipeg, who seems just as excited as we were.